And just like that, the Assad regime has fallen, and millions of Syrians, for the first time in generations, have a legitimate chance at a brighter future. So today we're going to talk about what the hell just happened over the course of 10 days. It wasn't even a full 2 weeks. So if you blinked, you probably missed something. We'll do our best to get you caught up in this video. We're going to talk about what we can expect from an HTS-led government in Syria. Take a look at a prison that was uncovered that some are referring to as a human slaughterhouse to give you an idea of just how brutal the Assad regime was to their own people. And then we'll step back and take a look at some international actions and reactions from Russia, the United States, and Israel. It's a lot to get into, so let's get started. Now, looking at this series of events, if we have to break this out, the HTS-led opposition forces began their offensive west of Aleppo on November 27th. Again, not that awful long ago, and then we have the Assad regime falling on December 8th. 10 days, start to finish, which is incredibly rapid compared to just about anything. And this war, by and large, the lines had been pretty stable for a couple years since a ceasefire was reached back in, I believe, 2019. There had been some encroachment by Assad forces into HTS-held territory, but HTS and opposition forces had not really retaken anything from Assad in a long, long time. So right when they started moving towards Aleppo, and we'll pull up some maps here to show you kind of a time lapse of how quickly this took place, there were a lot of folks saying they're not going to make it to Aleppo, and then it was they're not going to make it into Aleppo, they're certainly not going to take Aleppo, and then Aleppo fell. And then we just kind of blinked, and they moved south to Hama. Hama fell. Then they moved south to Homs. And before there was even really confirmation that Homs had fallen, there were opposition forces inside of Damascus and regime forces laying down their weapons. The momentum here was crazy, and that's something we talked about a couple days ago that I thought was worth rehashing here. There wasn't a lot of fighting, all things considered. When you look at how the rest of this war has played out and how deadly it has been to shift the lines even a little bit in certain areas, that is not what we just saw over the last 10 days. By and large, what we saw were regime forces choosing to not fight, laying down their arms, surrendering, or running away. And this is something we touched on in a previous video where I talked about the momentum that's taking place here when people are choosing not to fight may be fueled by the fact that we just aren't seeing videos on a wide-scale basis of revenge killing, torture, execution of religious or ethnic minorities, and definitely of the Assad regime forces. There have been countless videos of regime forces being taken prisoner, and they're definitely in captivity now, but they also weren't shot or beheaded on the side of the road or anything like that, which unfortunately has been a thing in this conflict. And I just want to say how crazy it is that these videos aren't happening. This doesn't appear to be a thing at this point, right? That's not a Syrian thing. That's a military thing. If you step back and look at this, you have these HTS, in this case, they have watched their friends and family members die at the hands of the Assad regime for years now. And this might be the first time in years, if not ever, they're face-to-face with regime forces, and they have total control. They can do whatever they want. It is not crazy to think that they would have individuals within that organization that just want revenge for their family members, right? And it doesn't appear to be happening. I don't want to say it hasn't happened at all, but we're not seeing that on a widespread basis. The optimistic side of me says that means that Jolani and the HTS leadership has enough control over their fighters, enough control over their forces to really hold back that basic human nature to try to get revenge on the people that killed, again, your friends and your family. Cautiously optimistic from that point of view. Now, I'm going to pull up a map here called Live UA Map to give you an idea of some of the territory and how the war has shaken out here in the last couple days. And a couple things I wanted to highlight. This is, again, public resource. I'll have it linked in the description below. The green is now considered HTS-held territory. And what I wanted to highlight was there are some folks at this point referring to this as the end of the Syrian civil war. I don't think that's accurate because even this map here, you can see there are still different factions in different parts of the country. We've got the HTS-led groups now here in the green, which happened very fast. But up here on the right, we do still have the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, and the Syrian National Army, SNA, that control portions of this yellow territory. Technically, they're not fighting HTS. There's been some kind words exchanged. There's also been some reporting of minor conflicts between the groups. But when you have the country still split like this, I think it's very hard to say that the Syrian civil war is over. It's probably just the next phase. Hopefully, they're able to consolidate power under one group and for the benefit of all Syrians. Now, one other thing I wanted to highlight here on the West Coast, the only red on this map still are actually the two Russian locations. We've got the naval base here at Tartus, and then we've got the airfield up here a little further north. So the entire map, the only red now are those two locations. I haven't heard very much about regime forces there anymore, if those forces still exist. But I just thought it was interesting that they do still have those flagged as Russian or as Assad controlled territory, if you will. And we'll get more into the whole Russian situation here in just a second. So a big question right now is Assad. Where is this guy? Not entirely clear. There have been a bunch of differing reports with no clear evidence at this point. There was some speculation that he boarded a plane and that plane was shot down, or crashed, or was maybe shot down by Russian air defense, which would have been a pretty crazy end to his brutal reign. But again, no evidence quite yet that happened. It does sound like Russia has granted him asylum. We haven't seen him show up in Russia. From all that I'm tracking, there has been no picture or video of Assad in the last couple days. So your guess is as good as mine. I would say it's unlikely that he's still in Syria, but outside of that, who knows? All right, so I think it's worth spending a couple minutes here on HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. For anybody who's been watching my videos for the last couple weeks, you can probably skip ahead like 90 seconds. For anybody who's hearing this for the first time, this might be some helpful context. So HTS, originally, we have to go back to like 2005 timeframe when their leader, Jolani, who is still the leader, and we'll see him giving speeches here in a minute, was a fighter, a member of al-Qaeda in Iraq. All right, that's where he was. He was arrested by U.S. and Iraqi forces, spent time in U.S. prisons there in Iraq, eventually was released, teamed up with al-Baghdadi, the leader of Islamic State, to push into Syria. At that time, he formed up Jabhat al-Nusra, which became the al-Qaeda affiliate inside of Syria. So rather than it was al-Qaeda in Iraq, rather than al-Qaeda in Syria, it was Jabhat al-Nusra. That was the official al-Qaeda affiliate. They did not partner with Islamic State, although he worked with Baghdadi to kind of help Islamic State move into Syria. Eventually, Jolani stepped away from Jabhat al-Nusra, shut that down, formed something called HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. In doing that in 2017, by and large, his goals were to kind of distance himself from more of the international jihadi movement and focus more on nationalistic aims, kind of the idea that he doesn't want to be associated with al-Qaeda or Islamic State. Now, at times, HTS has arrested al-Qaeda members inside of Syria, and they have conducted open combat operations against Islamic State. That said, there's clearly a mixed history there. Now, from the very start of this offensive, HTS has been saying the right things, like a Syria for all. They're going to form an inclusive government, and there's a place for everybody in this new country of theirs. It's moderate. It's inclusive. It's not probably what you or I would think of in terms of an inclusive government, but it's a far cry from what we saw Islamic State put up in previous years. I do want to add as well that the right flags are flying. So maybe that's really dumbing it down to like the lowest degree. But if you look at any of the pictures and the videos coming out right now from Damascus, Homs, Hama, Aleppo, there are at times some HTS flags, but by and large, we're seeing the independence flag, the Syrian flag being draped over government buildings and over airfields and down the street and things like that. That's very different than what we saw, when Islamic State took over portions of eastern Syria. They didn't move in there and put up Syrian flags. They put up Islamic State flags, right? Same thing in Afghanistan with the Taliban. They didn't move in and put up Afghanistan flags or Afghan flags. They went in and put up Taliban flags. So maybe it's an overly simplistic look, but I do think it's telling that the flags that are flying are Syrian flags, not the flags of a specific organization. Now, when looking at HTS, you kind of think of this as like a sliding scale between like a Western-style democracy on the one hand and all the way on the other, maybe like what Islamic State set up in Raqqa. HTS is not either one of those extremes, all right? So they are somewhere in the middle, which already makes this kind of a gray area. They've been much more moderate in Idlib, so they've had the opportunity to run governance in a portion of Syria for some time now, much more moderate than Islamic State or even the Taliban, but I would not be holding out hope for any sort of democratic-style elections anytime soon. That's not who they are either. Again, so somewhere between these two kind of extremes. Now, the negative side here when looking at HTS, which is a fully justified negative perception of this organization, is they're Salafi jihadi. They are a designated terrorist organization by the United States. Their leader, Jolani, has a bounty on his head, or arrest warrant price on his head for information leading to his arrest or death. It's a terrorist organization start to finish. It was formed from terrorist organizations. It's not good in that sense at all. The positive here is that HTS did run Idlib for a number of years. So they have some history and governance. And while they were there, they didn't appear to really allow any foreign terrorist organizations to base their operations in Idlib. And overall, they did have a pretty good track record of pretty fair governance. That said, I wouldn't spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the future is going to hold under HTS. There are so many unknowns in this conflict that just figuring out what is actually happening on the ground is going to be hard enough. So be very, very careful of any large predictions of how they're actually going to run the country. Now, they have been putting out the right things, and the right things as in not extremist things. There was a press conference just a couple days ago where they said, quote, "The city of Tartus has been liberated, and we are here with our people from all sects, Christians, Alawites, Sunnis, Druze, and Islamis. The Syrian people are one. To our people in Tartus, work with us to build our country. We will present a model to be proud of," end quote. And this kind of the governance piece is actually something that Aaron Zellin is really good at tracking and kind of keeping an eye on. I'll link his profile in the description below. He's somebody worth following for sure. And Zellin actually put out a note earlier today saying that Mohammed al-Bashir, the current prime minister of HTS's Salvation Government, so that's the HTS government entity in Idlib, is being tasked with forming the new government to manage the transitional period. They say currently he's meeting with Jolani, the head of HTS, to determine the arrangements of the transfer of power to avoid Syria entering a state of chaos. Again, the right things are being said. It does sound like Jolani is not interested in being the overall leader of Syria. We'll see. That might be reading between the lines, but again, there's a lot of positive things being said, if you will. All right, so I think we've kind of set the conditions and expectations. Syria is not about to become some sort of Western-style open democracy. That's not on the table. But a big question here is, could this be better for the Syrian people and for the world? And there was an interesting article here just put out by Kareem Shaheen in New Lines magazine. I thought this was worth going through word for word. He said, quote, "In terms of the Assad regime, they really did burn the country. Half the population displaced, countless people held in a network of Stalinist dungeons, augmented by a toxic surveillance state that pitted wife against husband, brother against sister, father against son. A punitive system that invented over 70 different ways of torturing prisoners. Over 400,000 dead, thousands killed in chemical attacks, thousands more killed with barrel bombs, barrels filled with TNT that were so inaccurate they had to be dropped far behind rebel lines on civilians in bread lines so they didn't accidentally kill their own troops. Persistent and paralyzing fear. A refugee crisis that reshaped Western politics, created the conditions for the establishment and flourishing of the Islamic State. It is very difficult to conceive of something worse that could come after." And I thought that was worth mentioning because it's been pretty bad. And I know Syria's kind of fallen out of the news in recent years, but it's been awful in a lot of ways, not just inside of Syria, but what that's led to around the world. So look, the bar is pretty low in terms of could the next thing be in any way, shape, or form better. I think it's worth remembering. Now, there's a lot of focus right now, understandably so, in the future, but we are in a phase right now where we have to remember to document the past. And one of those examples, a tragic example here that I think deserves a lot of attention, is the Sednaya prison. So this is something opposition forces and free Syrians now started to uncover, realizing that hundreds, maybe even thousands of people are trapped below ground in isolation. These are people that have been disappeared, essentially, right? Many of them held without any sort of charges. Their family members had no idea if they were alive or dead. They hadn't heard from them. In some cases, one of these guys, 40 years, probably held below ground 40 years. So they say that some of these folks are being held behind electronic locks and concealed doors with no way to get them out. And it's just a maze. There's pictures of opposition forces and Syrian citizens trying to figure out how to get to these people. Because if they don't get to them, they're just going to die down there by themselves, right? And they're trying to figure out how to get there, and it's just a complete mess, right? This is not there's not some clear blueprint of how to get from one spot to the next, and then a lot of the doors they can't even get through. So it sounds like what we're learning right now is that there were two levels. They're referring to it, and I'm not sure if this is being lost in translation, but white and red. So the white level is above ground, kind of a normal prison, all things considered. And then the red prison was underground. It was the secret area. That's where the torture and the atrocities were committed. So Syrians right now are referring to this prison as a human slaughterhouse. They're showcasing some pretty grisly torture devices that are being uncovered. And some of these prisoners are finally seeing freedom after being kept for years in solitary confinement with no daylight, most of whom, again, appear to have been kind of, quote, disappeared, right? Taken by the security state, and their relatives had no idea if they were alive or dead. There was one guy here, I'll show the picture. It appears that he was arrested 40 years ago as a political prisoner for some reason, would have been arrested by Bashar al-Assad's father. Now, there's already reports coming out, and this is the kind of thing, there's so much information right now, it's going to take a little while to sift through it, so take some of this with a grain of salt. This is one of those aspects. They say there are folks coming out missing limbs, others that have, for lack of a better term, have gone mad. They don't know their names. They don't know where they are. There have been reports of children coming out that may have been born in captivity. Again, take all of that with a grain of salt. Right now, it's very mixed reporting. Overall, though, we are seeing a lot of folks coming out that just can't believe that they're finally free. You kind of get the feeling that they had written off any sort of freedom at all as any possibility quite a while ago. Now, on the topic of this prison, there's a lot to document, a lot to detail here. I'm going to put together an entire video of what we're seeing. I think it's going to be something that's important to document for the future. It's going to be a couple days as I wait for more information to come out on that front, but it is going to get more of a deeper dive, if you will, than just a brief mention in today's video. Now, shifting over to more of the international picture, the actions and reactions from around the world, starting with the largest wave of U.S. airstrikes against Islamic State targets in Syria in quite a while. Now, some little behind-the-scenes context here. I actually got an invitation last week to travel with the Secretary of Defense and his team. Their media group reached out, asked if I could be a part of the press corps, essentially, right? So just sit with the press people and do what they do. And I went out to California for a couple days to Defense Innovation Unit and then to the Reagan Library for the Reagan National Defense Forum, and got to conduct a handful of pretty cool interviews. I've been publishing those on a couple different platforms so far. But one thing I wanted to highlight was I'm with those people as the Assad regime is falling. In terms of current events we've seen just in recent days, for the first time in years, people are talking about the possibility that Syria may fall under a new series of leadership. How do you think about situations like this when the group that is leading the charge, HTS, has some terrorist affinities in their past, versus the Assad regime, where there's not a clear good guy, if you will? How do you think about issues like that?
Well, this is a thing that is complex and it's evolving very, very rapidly. It's a thing that we're watching very closely. There are two things that are very important to me right now. One is, as you know, we have troops in that country. The protection of those troops, the safety of those troops, is of paramount importance to me, and we're absolutely focused on that. We've been working for many years now to defeat ISIS, and there's still a number of ISIS elements in that environment. We want to make sure that ISIS doesn't have the ability to resurge. So we'll remain focused on that as well. So very complex. How this will turn out, left to be seen, but something that we're watching every day.
So all things considered, pretty unified messaging. I thought it was interesting that messaging is coming out, and then the very next day we have this large-scale airstrike against Islamic State targets. Now, I did put out some content on X, Instagram, TikTok from that trip explaining all of it, and the plan is tomorrow we're doing kind of an emergency podcast episode on Unclassified because of all this craziness in Syria, and we're going to spend a good chunk of that, the second half, kind of diving into the behind the scenes of that trip, the invite, what it was like there, the questions I wanted to ask, what I did ask, all that stuff. So if interested, be sure to check that out. Now, the Central Command statement here said that they conducted dozens of precision airstrikes targeting known ISIS camps and operatives in central Syria on December 8th. They say the operation struck over 75 targets using multiple U.S. Air Force assets, including B-52s, F-15s, and A-10s. Battle damage assessments, they say, are underway, and there are no indications of civilian casualties. CENTCOM, together with allies and partners in the region, will continue to carry out operations to degrade Islamic State operational capabilities, even during this dynamic period in Syria. And then the commander of U.S. Central Command, General Kurilla, said, quote, "There should be no doubt we will not allow ISIS to reconstitute and take advantage of the current situation in Syria. All organizations in Syria should know that we will hold them accountable if they partner with or support ISIS in any way." And then shifted over to Israeli actions, actually. And this one was a little bit surprising, I have to say. So we have information now that Israeli troops actually moved into Syrian territory near the Golan Heights and conducted a series of airstrikes inside of Syria. So looking at some official IDF statements here, they say the IDF has deployed troops in the buffer zone and in a number of areas that are necessary to defend in order to ensure the security of the communities in the Golan Heights and the citizens of Israel. The Israeli military says its deployment of troops to the buffer zone between Israel and Syria is a temporary measure, but it may end up staying there for a long time depending on the developments. Following the fall of the Assad regime, the IDF has said that it is tracking advanced weapons in Syria and working to prevent them from reaching Hezbollah or any other hostile elements that could threaten Israel. So that's not crazy. I mean, the major pipeline of weapons to Hezbollah has been coming through Syria via Iran for a long time now, but it's not entirely clear to me why that requires a buffer zone on the ground in the Golan Heights. I mean, we've known for a couple weeks now that Israel has been conducting airstrikes against some of the supply routes, the border crossing points between Syria and Lebanon, and they're watching that, and they've destroyed some of those checkpoints, and they are conducting airstrikes inside of Syria now. I don't know what troops on the ground in Golan help with in that regard, but it's something worth keeping an eye on for sure. Now, Syrian media did report that Israeli airstrikes in the Dara and Suwaida areas in southern Syria, not far from the Israeli border, as well as the Meza air base near the capital, Damascus. The Israeli Air Force strikes in Syria today have been, quote, very intensive, defense sources told the Times of Israel. They say dozens of Israeli aircraft struck numerous targets across Syria with a focus on destroying strategic weapons that could fall into the hands of elements hostile to Israel following the collapse of the Assad regime. They added that the strikes have also targeted weapons production capabilities and air defense sites. From Israel's point of view, of course, right? They're going to take this as an opportunity to make sure that whatever comes next does not have some of those advanced weapons. May as well hit the air defense locations if you have them. They're not going to face any retaliation, really, from who at this point. So strategically, it makes sense for Israel to do some of this stuff. I'm kind of wondering what level of coordination they have with anybody on the ground, because you have to think at this point, Israel doesn't want to start something with HTS. They probably just want to remove some of the more advanced weaponry. Be interesting to find out if there's any degree of coordination there to make sure, hey, don't go near that airfield. Stop shooting TikTok videos on those fighter jets. We're going to destroy them. That kind of thing, but who knows? Now, moving over to Russia, there's really a couple major concerns they have as the Assad regime fell and is now out of power. First is they have troops and equipment in Syria, and the second is what Syria provides in terms of access to the Middle East and Africa. So starting with Rybar here, Russian media source, they say the fall of the Assad regime in Syria clearly puts Russia's naval base in Tartus and the airbase at Latakia at risk. Both facilities have played an important role in the logistics of Russian operations in Libya and the Sahel being a portion of Africa. They say, in this regard, it is worth considering alternative options for providing logistics in our African operations. After Syria, the next logistics hub for the Russian military leadership is Libya. At the same time, cargo planes can fly from Russia to Libya without refueling only if they are empty. But heavy, loaded vehicles will not be able to cover such long distances without stopping. Kind of pulls back Russia's ability to exert influence and conduct operations around the world. They say, thus, supplying operations in Africa via Libya becomes very expensive and unstable. Of course, there are naval bases in Tobruk, but the control is conditioned by the dual power situation in Libya. The situation can worsen at any moment, so it's not worth counting on them. Therefore, the loss of Syria as a transit base could be a blow not only to our positions in the Middle East, but also in Africa. It's pretty significant. Again, not shocking that Russia's focus has recently been the war in Ukraine, but this is a knock. They spent a lot of time, manpower, and money to develop Syria as a base of operations for them to project power across Middle East and Africa. We blinked, and in the last 10 days, that's probably gone. Now, there has been a lot of conversation about what's going to happen to the troops on the ground. There's a debate, there's some speculation right now that Turkey may be facilitating the exit of Russian material and personnel. Hasn't really materialized yet at this point. But remember, when we're talking about the Russian forces on the ground, for the most part, it's a naval base, so they could sail away, albeit probably have to move up to the Baltic Fleet, which is not all that close. And then the air base. And the air base is going to have to figure out where do they go? Because they have some aircraft there, not nearly enough aircraft to get out all their personnel and sensitive equipment. And then things like rotary wing assets aren't going to be able to fly very far, and some of the jets can only go so far. So a lot of questions still on what's actually going to happen with some of that equipment. There also have been some rumors in recent days that there are some Russian forces kind of left behind and surrounded on the ground in Syria. Fighter Bomber hit on this, Russian military blogger, who said, quote, "There's no news yet on the surrounded units. Everything is unchanged. They're holding a circular defense, burning equipment, their own, of course. At the moment, there is information about at least 3 positions of our units that have been cut off from the main forces. The necessary actions to unblock them are being taken." Now, it doesn't sound like at this point HTS or any opposition group has really been taking the fight to Russian forces. In the opening days, it looked like there may have been some Russian special operations forces killed. Now it appears more and more that they just captured that equipment. Haven't seen any announcements from Russia of any of their troops killed. And it's not clear that HTS is necessarily going to go after any of these Russian bases. We'll see. I wouldn't be shocked to see some sort of agreement struck between HTS and Russia, maybe to some degree, to allow the safe exit of their personnel. Now, turning to a couple statements here, one from current U.S. President Biden and one from President-elect Donald Trump. Biden put out a statement yesterday saying, quote, "It's a moment of historic opportunity for the long-suffering people of Syria to build a better future for their proud country. It's also a moment of risk and uncertainty." And that is kind of the theme across the board. You're seeing a lot of people, when you look at videos of Syrians in the streets, they're happy. They're celebrating. There are Christians celebrating in Syria because they see, for the first time, they see a light, right? There's a possibility that something could be better. There's no guarantee, and there's still a lot of things to sift out, but that's kind of the general theme on the ground that I've seen. President Biden continued saying, quote, "New opportunities are now opening up for the people of Syria and for the entire region. Looking ahead, the United States will do the following. First, we will engage with Syrian groups, including within the process led by the United Nations, to establish the transition away from the Assad regime towards an independent, sovereign Syria. Second, we will help ensure stability in eastern Syria, protecting our personnel against any threats. We will maintain our mission against ISIS. Third, we'll support Syria's neighbors, including Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Israel, should any threat arise from Syria during this period of transition. Finally, we will remain vigilant." And then U.S. President-elect Trump put out another statement. This was actually just before the Assad regime fell, because part of this was saying, like, it looks like Assad might fall. So the timing there, just for reference, was before that actually happened. He said, quote, "In any event, Syria is a mess. But this is not our friend, and the United States should not have anything to do with it. This is not our fight. Let it play out. Do not get involved." Now, a lot more there from Biden than Trump, because Biden is the current president and influencing current policy. I feel like it's more important to show that. But I also wanted to bring up something from Trump, given that, in 40 days now or so, it's going to be his decision on what happens with Syria going forward from a U.S. perspective, and if we get involved and to what degree. Now, looking forward, there's 5 real things I think that are worth keeping an eye on. The first and foremost is HTS governance. How do they govern? What does it look like? Do they keep their word of what they've been saying so far? How are they able to kind of consolidate power in certain areas, right? Are they able to, and this kind of bleeds into a second piece here, in the Northeast, how is HTS able to reconcile kind of disagreements or territorial disputes between themselves, SDF, and the SNA? There are some indications of some pushback in those regions. We'll see. If HTS is now the governing authority of Syria, they have to find a way to work with SDF and SNA, or the Syrian civil war won't be over. It'll just take a different form, and you'll continue to see some degree of fighting. So I kind of rolled 2 into 1 there. The third one here, overt foreign influence. We haven't really seen that at this point. Of course, speculation from every direction of who's actually involved and who's backing who, but that's all pure speculation without any evidence based in fact. So if we see something overt, right, boots on the ground, clear backing from a government trying to support one side or another, or putting some sort of energy behind, in this case, HTS and Jolani, worth keeping an eye on that. Russia, do they evacuate? How do they evacuate? What on earth is going to happen there? There is still a very real possibility that significant Russian advanced military equipment gets left behind. I mean, we've already seen countless kind of top-tier stuff get destroyed and captured by the rebels, but once you move inside the gates of the airfield and the naval base, it jumps quite a bit in terms of how sensitive it is. It's a very real possibility that they're not able to get all of that out before HTS ends up probably to some degree in charge of those facilities. And the last one here is it'll be interesting to see if the fall of Assad pressures Iran into taking any sort of drastic action anywhere, really. I mean, from Iran's point of view, right, think of how this has all played out. They lost Hamas. They've lost, what are we going to call it, half of Hezbollah, 90% of Hezbollah, a significant portion of Hezbollah's offensive capabilities, to include the pipeline was shut off to move weapons to them along the Syrian-Lebanon border. That was a couple weeks ago. They lost all of their Hamas and Hezbollah leadership. Now they lost Assad. This was their land bridge to Lebanon and to Hezbollah. It's happening pretty fast for Iran. It's hard to imagine they're just going to sit by and let these cards fall that keep hurting them one day after another. So let's keep an eye out, see if Iran takes any drastic action here in the coming days. It's a lot. For those of you that stuck with me start to finish here, really appreciate it. There'll be some links in the description below for some of these accounts, some of these maps, some of these websites that I think are really helpful to better understand this conflict. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.